Mr. O'Neill in?
No, madam, not to my knowledge.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Aaron Tartakovsky, co-founder and CEO of Epic CleanTec, which is a sustainability startup redefining how cities manage their water resources. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be on.
So I was doing a little bit of digging, and it looks like in your past, you've done some politics, some federal politics. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I think politics are sort of in my blood. My whole family is in different capacities involved in politics. I wrote my first political op-ed when I was 14 years old as a high school freshman. So, I went to college, but I was always involved in different political efforts. I studied political science in college. Then I went and got my master's in the Middle East, in Israel, in political science. And then I worked in federal politics. I worked for a major DC lobby. But now I like to call myself a recovering political operative. So no longer in the political world, but I do work in the infrastructure space and water, which is very political, which, was a surprise to me, but has actually been very useful for what we do at Epic CleanTec.
Very interesting. Well, we may have to have you back just to talk about politics. We don't usually talk about politics, but you could be a fun person to have.
Yeah.
So clearly, you have a passion for water reuse and water management, and you even co-authored a industry guide on water reuse. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us as to how and why you got so interested in water management?
Yeah. So look, it's an interesting thing. I think water is definitely something, especially for those of us here living in the U.S., it's something we take for granted. Not just water, but wastewater, meaning all the water that we use, we flush the toilet, we turn off our showers, and we never actually think about what happens next. We live in sort of what we like to call it a flush and forget society, which is great. It just means that we've designed our infrastructure so well that we don't really have to grapple with these issues. The only times we ever really hear about water or wastewater are when something bad happens, when we have, a sewer backup into your home, or, when we have sort of tragic instances like Flint, Michigan. So again, it's a testament to sort of the modern engineering, which is frankly a marvel of engineering that we have today. The problem sort of that we're dealing with, and which got me interested, is that when it comes to water, wastewater, sort of everything, all of our pipes, all of our facilities, everything was installed anywhere from 30 to 100 years ago. And everything needs to be repaired. Our pipes are falling apart. Our facilities are overburdened. We have more and more people moving into cities, putting more pressure on these old pipes. And we basically are at a point now where we have to try and rebuild the exact same way we've done things, which we don't have the money for, or we do something different. And it's that sort of pivotal moment that we're in that got me excited, thinking, wow, we have billions of people worldwide who don't have access to clean water and reliable sanitation. So, let's do something different here. And that was the initial spark for me. It's something we take for granted, but I knew nothing about. So, I spent months just reading and learning about this topic. And that's what ended up getting us sort of involved with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, doing work with them.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you that in just a second. But certainly, when we think about Israel as an example, where, I think they probably lead in terms of desalinization technology, for instance. And of course, water is a very important asset for them. And reclaimed water, of course, is also done very prudently as well. And I think, most of the U.S. parts or regions, generally, for the most part, I mean, I think we do okay with water in the sense of, generally having some availability to it. But, we're going to get into why you're focusing on the U.S. market versus, let's say, overseas. But you mentioned Bill and Melinda Gates. The company that you've developed, is it correct that it came out of the Reinvent the Toilet Challenge? And
Yeah,
what was
exactly.
that about?
Yeah. So the what we like to say is sort of the innovations of Epic CleanTec were born out of work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So, as the story goes, one of my co-founders was walking down the streets of Tel Aviv one day with his little pug dog named Polly. Polly did his business on the sidewalk, as little dogs do. My partner was a police officer, came driving by, sees this and writes him up a fine. Him being the fiery tempered Israeli entrepreneur that he is, rather than just paying the fine and moving on with his life, decided that he was going to create a new solution to clean up after dogs. So not necessarily the most pressing issue of our time, but an issue nonetheless. They ended up designing a device that very quickly converted the dog waste into a high quality fertilizer product. So it was actually essentially, think of a high-tech pooper scooper device. It picked up the waste, dosed it with a little chemical, mixed it together, created a chemical reaction, went from from wet, smelly waste into dry product. That innovation got the attention of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who at the time were running something, as you mentioned, called the Reinvent the Toilet Challenge. And the basic premise of that challenge is what sort of underpins what we do now as a company, which is billions of people don't have access to clean water and reliable sanitation. There's many parts of the world that can't build sort of complicated underground sewer infrastructure like, we take advantage of in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, Chicago, New York. So the question was, how do we create solutions that we can deploy quickly, inexpensively to these populations without having to build out complicated infrastructure? And so the analogy is with telecom. So in this country, in the United States, we spent decades developing telecommunications. So we had big poles and wires. And then over time, we started transitioning to a decentralized approach with cell phones. In many parts of the world, they got to skip those early steps of building out complicated infrastructure, going straight to cell phones. So the thinking was, can we do for water and wastewater what cell phones did for telecom? And so from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we then took sort of those early innovations and we started this company, Epic CleanTec. So not just doing sort of one single toilet at a time in a developing world context, but can we do entire buildings or entire communities or entire areas? So rather than sort of big plants that are all fed by, thousands of miles of sewer pipeline, can we have sort of little mini grids? And that was the initial work was formed from the Gates Foundation. And we've sort of been developing this approach in the urban world for the past 6 years.
Well, I think the big news is that Paulie is feeling pretty good about what he does, knowing that his waste will be for good use.
Right.
So, going back to what you said about this notion of decentralization of wastewater treatment, as well as what you said before, is the aging infrastructure. And again, water is just one of kind of the fundamental basic infrastructure, but there's also gas pipe. And we've seen, what happens when gas pipes leak and eventually explode. The reality for some of these kind of legacy cities is very difficult, and it's almost politically and fiscally impossible to really truly retrofit. And so to that point, the solution you're providing is quite interesting. However, it does raise a question, which is it's this transference of ownership. So before it used to be a city service, now it's become a building service or a property owners, under their management. Can you talk about what that means and how has that been received by those that are managing the properties?
Yeah, no, so it's an interesting question because, unlike a lot of other products, water, access to water and access to sanitation is, it's a basic human right. It's any, wherever you live, you're going to get access to that. And it's, as you noted, it's typically provided by a municipal utility. So for us, however, we can't operate independently of the utility. I think the incentive for a building owner or a developer to work with us is they want to save money on their water and their sewer bills. Those bills are set by the utility. So we're not sort of completely decentralized from the utility in the sense that we're always going to be working with them. And it's not really decentralized versus centralized, but it's actually the two working together, sort of in tandem. Now, at the end of the day, your point is right, that our bills are being paid by these building owners and developers. And so really it's just a matter of education. Going back to that sort of flush and forget attitude I mentioned earlier, most people never really think about or grapple with these issues. So for us, we have to convince someone who's building a $500 million high rise in downtown San Francisco why having a wastewater treatment reuse system in their building makes sense. Now, San Francisco, this is again where the politics comes into play. San Francisco is actually the first city in the nation to require that all large buildings, so every building over 250,000 square feet, now has to have an on-site wastewater recycling program. That's something that we didn't initiate, but we worked with a lot of different stakeholders to help that happen. And now in the state of California, we now have legislation in place which says any city in California that wants to have a local water recycling program can do so, and the state regulators, specifically the public health folks, are basically coming up with a uniform playbook for how every city can do this. And so you can't do that with just the building owners and developers. You can't just do that with the utilities. You need buy-in from a lot of different stakeholders in order to make these sort of large systemic changes. And so that's something, frankly, as a startup, we never thought we'd be grappling with, that, we are actually stitching together all these sort of major folks. And, we started in San Francisco, but now we're working in LA, we're working in San Diego, and plan on being in a lot more cities in the next 5 years.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's really pulling, your political science, your politics, your public policy background, as well as your entrepreneurship as well. And it's got some analogies to kind of the solar roof industry, in the sense of both the kind of the legislative aspect, but also the tax credit. And I think what we're seeing is for new buildings even being integrated or incorporated into the code or the permit as well.
Yeah.
But that process it's very difficult. I mean, it needs to be driven at a federal or state or county level. That's a big undertaking for such a small company with, without less necessarily a very deep bench of, those that are influencing people in the Congress. How are you guys able to navigate some of these things, given the fact that, again, working with very large public utilities in cities and other stakeholders, it's very complex.
Yeah, no. So I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head. That it is. There's a lot we're taking on, but sort of to use your own analogy, looking at the energy world, sort of the distribution of energy, whether it's rooftop solar or wind. The benefit we have is we saw what they did. We saw what happened in the energy world, and we have the benefit of learning from the things that went well and the things that didn't go well. And I think what we're doing now in water and wastewater is what the energy folks did. We're just 10 to 15 years behind. So we have sort of that playbook to sort of learn from. But you're right. It does involve a lot of different folks. And, I think we're not really focused on the federal level. I think I think this exists just not just for us, but frankly for anyone working in a regulatory heavy industry, whether it's water, wastewater, whether it's healthcare, whether it's transportation, is that it is easier to sort of affect change on the local level. And that is why we're sort of starting city by city. I mean, some of this stuff where we are working on the state level, but, water and wastewater is one of the more fractured industries out there. I think to use, you mentioned Israel earlier. Israel is one of the most effective countries in the world when it comes to how they manage their water, wastewater resources. They reuse close to 90% of all the wastewater in the entire country. The US is somewhere in the realm of 2 to 3%, which on the one hand is a little bit dispiriting, but on the other hand, that just means that, we have a very long way to go, and there's a lot of opportunity for us to do things better. But you're right. I think, at the end of the day, we are sort of punching above our weight as a smaller company, sort of in terms of affecting policy. but frankly, that's one of the most fun things for us. I mean, we're helping to literally change the game, and we don't see ourselves as just, bringing a solution to the table and walking away. We're actually trying to change the conversation around water and wastewater, because it's not just about making a change for us as a company. We think the models we're developing for cities can be how the sort of planet is able to keep up with urban population growth. I mean, to borrow a statistic from our old buddy Bill Gates, we're going to see about 70% of the world's population living in cities by 2050. The rate at which we're building new cities is like adding a new Manhattan every single month until that time. So now's the moment for us to sort of start having these conversations, and that's why we're not afraid to get involved in things like politics.
Yeah. So going back to the solar industry as just a way for people to kind of get their arms around this, is that I think subsidies and tax credits and rebates and so forth played a big part in people's decision to consider solar roofs.
Yeah.
And I think now we're starting to see more of a pull effect, because if they have an electric vehicle or vehicles, it just makes more sense to have solar. So in the case of wastewater and reclaimed water, what is that pull in the absence of subsidies, tax rebates, and other incentives?
Yeah, I think, again, that's one of the lessons we learned. We want to make sure that what we are doing is not going to be just reliant on subsidies and on grants. We want it to be able to stand, just on how much we're going to be saving our customers alone, just on their bills. So operating within the existing framework. And so, for us, we can go into, let's take a building. Let's say normally in a year, they're going to use 100,000 gallons a day. By incorporating our system, we're going to help them reuse, let's say, 50% of that water. So that's 50% less water that they're going to be pulling in from the city, because that's water being reused in their building for things like toilet flushing, for irrigation, for cooling towers, for laundry water. So we're going to be reducing their water bill by 50%, and we're going to be reducing their sewer bill as well, because not only are they using less water, but they're putting less wastewater back into the city sewers. So our entire business model is contingent upon just saving those building owners and developers on their ongoing water and sewer bills. And so everything else, whether it's LEED points, so sort of in the environmental standard for buildings, or whether it's local grants, some cities do have grants. San Francisco, for example, will give you a grant if you sort of save X amount of gallons a year. But we want to make sure that this whole approach can stand up on its own, and anything else is just sort of a cherry on top.
So we're going to come back to this in just a second in terms of kind of more of a, let's call it a distribution, target and distribution model, but I'll come back to that. Let's go a little bit higher level. Mm-hmm. So, I think with climate change, we're starting to see some pretty material and adverse effect to freshwater supply, whether it's coming from the mountains, snow cap, or water reservoirs, or, underground water tables. How is that putting more stress in terms of water resources?
Yeah, no, look, I think it's causing a lot of stress. I think, our inability to rely on the weather, or I should say changing climate patterns, is causing a lot of havoc for water. It's the reason why we sort of, every time we come out of a drought, we're going right back into another drought. And I think one thing that sort of people sort of forget is that we have a fixed amount of water on this planet. There's a water cycle. So it's not like we don't have water. We just don't have water in the right places. So everything with climate change is exacerbating these issues. We have wetter wets, we have hotter hots, we have drier dries. And when it comes to water, we have cities, for example, who are drawing a certain amount of water, but we need to balance that with ag. In a drought year, we have serious issues of water supply. How do we make sure that, all of these different folks who are needing water are going to get it? And so the reason why we are sort of moving towards water reuse is because we are sort of technologically advanced as a society that we shouldn't have to rely on the rain for our water. So in San Francisco, as an example, why are we using fresh water from our national parks to flush our toilets? And we can be manufacturing water in the basement of these buildings to do functions like that. So we're still going to be using fresh water for drinking for now. I think that'll change in the next 5-10 years. But for right now, why not recycle all this water locally, which not only is going to diversify our water supply portfolio, but as you mentioned, right now we pump water from Northern California over mountains to Southern California. But what if Northern California and Southern California were just producing all their own water locally? And how much energy are we going to save just by not having to pump water over mountains? I think we just do it because that's how we've been doing it. But we're at a point now where we can do things a lot smarter, frankly.
Well, not to mention, I think the relationship between North Cal and South Cal would be much improved as a result. Speaking of, kind of this macro pressure, there is a growing momentum, and I think it's a hyper growth around green hydrogen. Mm-hmm. And most of it, of course, is going to be coming from electrolysis, or the splitting of water into hydrogen and oxygen molecules. Mm-hmm. How do you foresee that as we start to use, liquid hydrocarbons and use more of the green hydrogen, in not just in transportation like cars, but industrial context as well? How is that going to put even more pressure in terms of water resources?
Well, I mean, well, first thing I'll say is I am of our entire team, I'm the only non-technical person. So I'll have to defer to our engineers sort of on a more technical analysis. But, I think the bottom line is that, we're creating, whether it's that technology or others, we're basically creating new avenues to be dealing with water. I think, I've seen in some of your talks, you talk about sort of we're industrialization 4.0. We talk about being in our industry, we talk about being in water 4.0, where we are basically moving away from sort of how things have been done to whether it's decentralization, whether it's smart water, and taking technologies like this and sort of creating, transportation is a perfect example of being able to connect two industries that have traditionally not been in bed together. So, I think I can't really comment on the technical feasibility of it, but I will say is that, we are seeing more and more how people are seeing how water is connected to literally everything. There's not a single industry which is not touched by water. It's not just about water coming out of your tap. Every single manufacturing process, even computer chips, having semiconductor water pure enough to go through that process is essential. So we're going to continue to see sort of the ever presence of water. The lack of water is going to create more urgency for people to create these types of solutions.
So I want to go back to this topic around distribution and target segments. So, clearly, hospitals, resorts and hotels, as an example, would make a lot of sense. Yeah. But from a distribution, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to go to every property owner. So can you elaborate in terms of, how are you leveraging, let's say, for example, private equity, those that are holding large real estate properties, and they're thinking of from a portfolio versus at a property level? Yeah.
So I think we right now are not focused on, a house by house basis. I think it is difficult for a number of reasons to build out that infrastructure. I think there are technologies that are focused on sort of that level, but for us as a company, we are focused on what we say higher density projects. So, a small plot of land, but a lot of people living on it. So that looks like a high rise. It looks like a campus. It looks like a sort of a master development with different projects. So, I think we are focused on the largest players in that world. Right now we're working with folks like Crescent Heights and like Related, two of the largest multifamily developers in the nation. We're working with, Gensler, the largest architectural and design firm in the world. We're working with the biggest engineering firms because we want them to be able to roll this out to their massive footprints. But, also working with, it's not, we sort of haven't necessarily gone with sort of the private equity route, but going and directly talking to the largest companies who have big footprints, the Walmarts of the world and the other tech companies who have massive real estate footprints and who understand that, it's not just about, being green and doing good. They realize that these approaches can save them money, because at the end of the day, as much as we want to believe that people are going to do this sort of out of the goodness of their heart, it's going to be the economics that drive the decisions whether or not they're going to incorporate these approaches into their projects. So, it's about increasing asset value. Greener buildings are not only scientifically proven to be healthier buildings, but they are, by a number of metrics, they can show that these people can actually charge higher rents. The property values go up when they incorporate these approaches into their portfolios.
All right. So we just have one more minute left. With the question that we always ask is lessons learned. You talked about many different facets of the complexities and challenges within this industry. Can you talk about a project or a product failure and lessons learned from that?
Yeah. I think it's sort of an often repeated sort of startup entrepreneur cliche that you always have to budget more, both in terms of time and money than what you think. And I think for us, when we sort of started going on this, and at the end of 2014, we thought, within 1 year we're going to have these systems installed all over the country. But I think the biggest lesson learned is, these things take time, especially when you're working in sort of a very regulatory heavy entrenched industry, but not to be dissuaded by that, to understand that I think we romanticize overnight successes in sort of the startup world, when in fact, most of the time it took a little bit longer than that. But, I think it's part of the journey. And as long as we're still having fun, then we're going to keep doing this.
It's a worthwhile endeavor. And with that, I've been joined by Aaron Tartakovsky, CEO of Epic CleanTec. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.